He handed me divorce papers with a smirk, but he had no idea his family heirlooms were gone forever. The coffee cup between my hands had gone cold, but I couldn't bring myself to take a sip anyway. Across the polished mahogany table of Le Petit Jardin, Richard sat with that familiar half-smile playing on his lips, the one that always made me feel like I was somehow failing a test I hadn't known I was taking. He slid the divorce papers across the table with the same casual grace he used to close million-dollar deals. "It's all very straightforward, Madeline," he said, his voice carrying that practiced gentleness he reserved for difficult clients and wayward employees. "Clean break, fair settlement. You can have your lawyer look it over, but I assure you, everything is in order." I watched his manicured fingers tap the signature line, fighting the urge to laugh at how perfectly this moment captured our 15 years of marriage. Here he was, orchestrating even our ending, convinced he had everything under control. The Richard Lawson playbook. Predict, plan, execute. He'd probably already rehearsed this scene in his mind, imagining how I'd react. Tears, perhaps, or desperate pleading. That's how he saw me. Predictable, manageable Madeline. The waiter approached with fresh coffee, but I waved him away. Through the cafe's floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see autumn leaves skittering across Madison Avenue, free and chaotic. My hand didn't shake as I reached for the Mont Blanc pen Richard had placed beside the papers. His pen, of course. Even this small detail had been choreographed. "You seem..." Richard paused, studying my face with the first hint of uncertainty I'd seen today, calmer than I expected. I met his gaze, taking in the subtle signs of aging that his expensive skincare routine couldn't quite hide. The fine lines around his eyes, the slight softening along his jaw. He was still handsome at 52, but time was beginning to catch up with him, just as reality soon would. "What did you expect, Richard? For me to make a scene? Create a spectacle for all these lovely people enjoying their $1,000 lunches?" He chuckled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've always been quite contained. It's one of your better qualities. Contained, like a well-trained pet or a carefully pruned garden." I wondered what he'd say if he knew about the nights I'd spent poring over his family's financial records, the quiet meetings with Olivia, the careful orchestration of what was about to unfold. I thought about Victoria, his 28-year-old girlfriend, probably waiting in some luxury condo he'd bought her, imagining the life of privilege that was about to slip through her perfectly manicured fingers. I signed my name with deliberate strokes, watching the blue ink flow across the paper. Each letter felt like a key turning in a lock, but not the one Richard thought he was securing. The signature wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. "There," I said, pushing the papers back to him. "You're free." He gathered the documents with efficient movements, tucking them into his leather briefcase. "I know this isn't easy, Madeline, but you'll see it's for the best. My lawyer will file these today, and then we can both move forward." He stood, adjusting his Brioni suit jacket. "The house is yours for the next month, as discussed. I assume that's enough time to make arrangements." I nodded, watching him pull out his wallet and place several crisp hundreds on the table. More than enough to cover our untouched lunch. Always generous with money. My soon-to-be ex-husband. At least, while he still had it. "Goodbye, Richard," I said softly. He hesitated for a moment, perhaps caught off guard by the hint of something in my voice. Was it pity? Then he was gone, striding through the restaurant with the confidence of a man who believed he'd won. I remained at the table, finally picking up my cold coffee and taking a sip. Through the window, I watched him emerge onto the street, phone already at his ear, probably calling Victoria to celebrate. The autumn sun caught his silver hair, creating a brief halo effect before he disappeared into his waiting town car. My own phone buzzed with a text from Olivia. "Done?" I typed back a single word. "Done." Then I gathered my bag, left a generous tip of my own, and walked out into the crisp October air. Unlike the papers I'd just signed, my real signature, the one on the documents Olivia had quietly filed weeks ago, was already changing everything. Richard just didn't know it yet. I turned toward Park Avenue, where the trees were ablaze with red and gold. For the first time in 15 years, I felt truly awake, truly present. The game Richard thought he was winning was already over. A new one was about to begin. I was in the middle of packing up Richard's beloved vinyl collection when my phone erupted with his ringtone. Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries. His choice. Naturally. I watched it vibrate across the antique desk, the same desk where I'd found the first clue about his grandmother's testament 3 months ago. 5 hours had passed since our meeting at Le Petit Jardin, right on schedule. The phone stopped, then immediately started again. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our, soon-to-be his, penthouse, I could see storm clouds gathering over Central Park. Perfect weather for a revolution. When it rang for the third time, I finally answered, "You manipulative bitch." His voice trembled with a rage I'd never heard before. "What have you done?" I sat in his leather chair, running my fingers over the worn armrests. "I assume you've spoken with Mr. Harrison. Theodore Harrison, the family's longtime estate lawyer, must have delivered the news by now. The entire Lawson fortune, the real estate holdings, the investment portfolios, the art collection, everything inherited from his grandmother, had been legally transferred to the newly established Harper Lawson Foundation for Education and Healthcare. The paperwork had been processed weeks ago, while Richard was too busy with Victoria to notice the subtle changes in his accounts. "You had no right," he snarled. "That money was my inheritance. My family's legacy. Actually, I had every right." I opened the desk drawer, touching the copy of his grandmother's will I'd found there. "Your grandmother's testament was quite clear. All assets would pass to your spouse if you ever violated the fidelity clause. Did you really never read the fine print, Richard?" The silence on the other end was deafening. I could almost see him in his office at Lawson Industries, his perfect world crumbling around him. The thought should have brought me joy, but instead, I felt a strange emptiness. "I'll fight this," he finally said, his voice deadly quiet. "I'll have the best lawyers tear apart every word of that will. You think you're clever, Madeline? You have no idea what I'm capable of." "No, you're the one who had no idea what I was capable of." I stood up, walking to the window. "The foundation is ironclad, Richard. Olivia made sure of that. By the way, she sends her regards." Another pause. "Olivia? My Olivia? My personal lawyer?" "Your former lawyer," I corrected him. "She resigned from your firm this morning. Apparently, she's tired of watching you destroy people's lives." Thunder rumbled outside, and I watched lightning split the darkening sky. In the glass reflection, I could see the woman I'd become. Someone stronger than the young girl who'd fallen for Richard's charm 20 years ago. Someone who'd finally learned to play his game better than he could. "The Foundation's first board meeting is tomorrow," I continued, keeping my voice steady. "We're discussing funding for 3 new children's hospitals and a scholarship program for underprivileged students. Your grandmother would have loved it. Don't you dare speak about her." His voice cracked. "She trusted me with everything she built, and you betrayed that trust the moment you decided your marriage vows meant nothing." I closed my eyes, remembering the day I'd discovered his affair with Victoria. Not through texts or lipstick stains, but through his careless arrogance. He'd literally brought her to his grandmother's favorite restaurant, the one where he'd proposed to me. "Your grandmother knew you better than you thought, Richard. She put that clause in her will for a reason." The sound of breaking glass came through the phone, followed by muffled cursing. "When I'm done with you..." "You'll what?" I interrupted. "Destroy me. Take everything I have. You already tried that. The difference is, I didn't do this for money. I did it because someone needed to show you that actions have consequences." A sharp knock at the penthouse door made me turn. Through the frosted glass, I could see Olivia's silhouette, right on time. "I have to go," I said. "The movers are here for your art collection. Don't worry, every piece is being donated to public museums. At least people will finally get to see them, instead of having them locked away in your private vault. Madeline, wait." I ended the call and opened the door. Olivia stood there, impeccable in her charcoal suit, a thick folder tucked under her arm. Behind her, a team of art handlers waited respectfully. "Ready?" she asked, her eyes searching my face for any sign of doubt. I nodded, leading them into the penthouse. "Start with the Monet in the living room," I instructed the handlers. "It's going to the Metropolitan Museum of Art." As they began carefully removing the massive painting from the wall, Olivia touched my arm. "Victoria just left him," she said quietly. "Apparently, she's not interested in dating a man who can't even afford his country club membership anymore." I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt tired, but free. "Have you heard from Daniel Brooks, the journalist? He's already requesting an interview about the foundation." Olivia smiled. "Apparently, the story of a billionaire's fortune being turned into the largest private charitable foundation of the year is quite newsworthy." Outside, the storm was breaking, rain lashing against the windows. Soon, this penthouse would be empty, its treasures redistributed to people who would appreciate them. Soon, Richard would learn what it meant to lose everything. But as I watched the art handlers work, I realized this wasn't really about Richard anymore. It was about what came next. About taking all that privilege and power and finally using it for something meaningful. "Call Daniel," I told Olivia. "Tell him I'll do the interview." It's time people understood that this isn't a story about revenge. She raised an eyebrow. No, I said, watching as the Monet was carefully wrapped in protective covering. It's a story about justice, and it's only just beginning. The morning of the Foundation's first board meeting, I woke up to my face splashed across every major news outlet in New York. "Lawson fortune, redirected to charity and divorce shock," screamed the Post. The Times was more restrained. "Billion-dollar divorce settlement creates new charitable foundation." My favorite was from some tabloid. "Rich man's ex takes everything and gives it away." I'd moved into a modest hotel suite after leaving the penthouse. Nothing like the luxury I'd grown accustomed to during my marriage. The simple room felt more like home than any of Richard's carefully curated spaces ever had. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I scrolled through my phone, reading snippets of speculation and scandal. A text from Daniel Brooks popped up. "Ready for today? The vultures are circling." He wasn't exaggerating. When I stepped out of the hotel's side entrance, a small crowd of reporters was already waiting. Someone must have tipped them off. I straightened my navy blazer, not designer, but well-tailored, and faced them directly. "Mrs. Lawson," they shouted over each other, "is it true you donated everything? Did you plan this before the divorce? What does Richard Lawson have to say?" "It's Ms. Harper now," I corrected the nearest reporter, keeping my voice steady. "And all your questions will be answered at this afternoon's press conference." My Uber driver, no more private car service, looked starstruck as I slid into the back seat. "You're her, aren't you? The lady who gave away all that money?" "I didn't give it away," I said, watching the reporters grow smaller in the side mirror. I redirected it to where it could do some good. The Foundation's temporary offices occupied a floor in a downtown building, nothing like the gleaming Lawson Industries Tower in Midtown. As I walked into the conference room, I found Olivia already there with our newly appointed board members. Dr. Sarah Chen, a pioneering pediatric surgeon, Marcus Williams, an education reform advocate, and Elena Rodriguez, an expert in sustainable community development. "The media's going crazy," Elena said, looking up from her tablet. "Twitter can't decide if you're Robin Hood or a gold digger. Let them talk." I took my seat at the head of the table, trying to ignore how strange it felt to sit there instead of being the quiet wife in the corner. "And we have work to do." We were halfway through discussing the Children's Hospital initiative when my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was a photo of Richard and me on our wedding day, followed by a text. "Remember when you were happy being nothing?" I deleted it without responding, but my hands were shaking slightly as I set down the phone. "You okay?" Olivia asked softly. "Fine." I forced myself to focus on Dr. Chen's presentation about medical equipment needs, but the message had struck a nerve. Had I ever really been happy being nothing? Or had I just been afraid of being something more? The rest of the morning passed in a blur of proposals and budgets. By the time we broke for lunch, we'd approved funding for 2 hospitals and established the framework for the scholarship program. It felt surreal, making decisions that would actually help people, not just add zeros to some offshore account. Daniel Brooks was waiting in the lobby when I came down for lunch. He looked exactly like his Twitter profile, sharp-eyed, slightly rumpled, with the intense energy of someone who lived for uncovering stories. "Ms. Harper," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." We found a quiet corner in a nearby cafe. I watched him set up his recorder, remembering all the business lunches I'd attended as Richard's wife, seen but not heard. "So," Daniel began, "let's start with the obvious question. Why? You could have fought for half his fortune in the divorce. Instead, you gave everything away. What drove that decision?" I took a sip of water, choosing my words carefully. "Have you ever held on to something so tightly that you didn't realize it was actually holding you prisoner?" He leaned forward, intrigued. "Go on." "The Lawson fortune wasn't just money. It was power, privilege, and responsibility. Richard's grandmother understood that. She built something meaningful from nothing, but she watched her grandson turn it into a monument to his ego." I paused, remembering the few times I'd met the formidable old woman. The clause in her will wasn't just about infidelity, it was about character, and you waited to execute it until after he filed for divorce. I waited until I was sure about what needed to be done. A memory flashed through my mind. Richard laughing at a charity gala when someone suggested he donate to a local school. Why waste money on people who'll never amount to anything? He'd said. Daniel's next question was softer. Are you afraid of him? There are rumors he's not taking this well. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. You think you're safe in that cheap hotel? I know exactly where you are. I showed the message to Daniel, whose eyes widened. Are you being threatened? Richard's world is falling apart, I said, deleting the message. He's lashing out, but he's not my concern anymore. The Foundation's work is what matters now. And what about you? Daniel asked, turning off his recorder. Off the record, what does Madeline Harper want for herself? The question caught me off guard. For so long, I'd been defined by what Richard wanted, what the social circle wanted, what everyone else wanted. What did I want? I started, then stopped, surprised by the emotion in my voice. I want to be someone my younger self wouldn't recognize, someone who doesn't ask permission to exist, someone who builds things instead of just maintaining them. Daniel nodded, scribbling something in his notebook. That's your real story, isn't it? Not the money or the revenge. It's about becoming. Outside the cafe window, I caught a glimpse of a familiar figure watching me, Victoria, looking lost without her designer handbag and luxury car. Our eyes met briefly before she hurried away, another ghost from a life I was leaving behind. Yes, I said, turning back to Daniel. It's about becoming, and I'm just getting started. The legal notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, thick with legalese and thinly veiled threats. I read it over my third cup of coffee in my new apartment, a modest 2-bedroom in Brooklyn that would have horrified Richard's social circle. The document was impressive in its aggression. Claims of fraud, mental instability, undue influence. Richard's new legal team was throwing everything at the wall to see what might stick. He's claiming I was mentally unfit when I signed the transfer documents, I told Olivia over the phone, unable to keep the bitter amusement from my voice. Apparently, my vindictive actions are evidence of severe psychological disturbance. Classic Richard, Olivia replied, the sound of shuffling papers in the background. He's filed for an emergency injunction to freeze the Foundation's assets. The hearing is set for Friday. I walked to the window, looking out at the tree-lined street below. My new neighborhood was alive with actual life, children walking to school, elderly couples on morning strolls, food delivery cyclists zipping past. So different from the sterile luxury of his, old world. What are our chances? Honestly, his case is weak. The documentation is solid. The timing is legal, and your grandmother-in-law's will is airtight. But, she paused, he's hired Preston Mills. My stomach clenched. Preston Mills was the kind of lawyer who didn't just win cases, he destroyed lives. I'd watched him systematically dismantle the reputation of one of Richard's business rivals 2 years ago, turning a respected CEO into a pariah through a combination of legal manipulation and media warfare. He's going to try to break me in public, isn't he? That's Preston's specialty, Olivia confirmed, and we should prepare for everything to come out. Your therapy sessions after the miscarriage, the anxiety medication, every private moment that could be twisted into something sinister. I sat down heavily on my second-hand couch, remembering those dark days 3 years ago. Richard had been unsupportive, in his way, hiring the best doctors, arranging for discreet treatment, but he'd never once asked how I felt, what I needed. The loss had been an inconvenience to him, a problem to be solved and filed away. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Chen. Emergency at the Foundation. Need you here ASAP. I have to go, I told Olivia. The Foundation needs me. Madeline, she said softly, maybe you should step back. Let the board handle things until this legal battle is over. That's exactly what Richard wants. I grabbed my bag, already heading for the door. I'm done hiding. The Foundation's office was chaos when I arrived. News vans crowded the street, and reporters shouted questions as I pushed through them. Inside, Elena was arguing with someone on the phone while Marcus paced, tablet in hand. What's happening? I demanded. Our major banking partners are getting nervous, Elena explained, covering her phone. Someone's been calling them, suggesting they might face legal complications if they continue working with us. 3 banks have already frozen our accounts. Richard, I muttered. Of course he'd use his financial connections against us. It gets worse, Marcus added. The children's hospital project, the land we were about to purchase for it. The seller just backed out. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of it all pressing down. This was Richard's real power. Not just his money, but his influence, his ability to make people fall in line through subtle pressure and implied threats. But as I stood there, surrounded by the chaos he'd created, something shifted inside me. I opened my eyes and saw not a crisis, but my team looking to me for leadership. Not Richard's quiet wife anymore, but the woman who had outmaneuvered him at his own game. Elena, call a press conference for this afternoon. Marcus, get me everything we have on alternative properties for the hospital. And someone find me Daniel Brooks. They stared at me for a moment, then jumped into action. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I'd been saving for the right moment. Janet, it's Madeline Harper. Yes, Richard's soon-to-be ex-wife. Remember that story you told me at last year's Christmas party? About what really happened with the Anderson merger? I think it's time people heard the truth. Janet had been Richard's executive assistant for 15 years. She'd seen everything, documented everything, and she'd been waiting for a chance to speak. 2 hours later, I stood before a forest of microphones, cameras flashing. Daniel Brooks stood to the side, notepad ready, a small smile playing on his lips. Yes, Richard Lawson is trying to shut down our foundation, I began, my voice steady. He's using every weapon in his arsenal. Legal threats, banking pressure, character assassination, and do you know why? I leaned forward slightly. Because for the first time in his life, he's facing something he can't control. The truth. I pulled out a stack of documents. Janet's records, detailing years of Richard's questionable business practices. The truth about how the Lawson fortune was really made. The truth about who Richard Lawson really is. And most importantly, the truth about what this foundation represents. Not revenge, but restoration. The reporters surged forward with questions, but I held up my hand. Everything you need to know is in these documents. Mr. Brooks will help distribute them. And to the banks considering whether to continue working with us, you might want to read them carefully before choosing sides. As I stepped away from the podium, my phone buzzed. Richard, you have no idea what you've just started. I typed back my first direct response to him in weeks. No, Richard, I know exactly what I've started. The question is, do you? Back in my office, I found a small package waiting on my desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a letter from Richard's grandmother, dated just weeks before her death. It had been forwarded by her old housekeeper. And my dear Madeline, it began, if you're reading this, you've finally found your voice. Use it well. I pressed the letter to my chest, feeling tears threaten. Then I straightened my shoulders and went back to work. There were hospitals to build, lives to change, and a legacy to reshape. Richard might have started this war, but I would decide how it ended. The courthouse steps were a sea of reporters and protesters. Signs bobbed above the crowd. Eat the rich. Harper Lawson Foundation saves lives. And more disturbingly, gold-digging witch. I gripped Olivia's arm as we pushed through, the morning air thick with tension and camera flashes. Remember, Olivia murmured, Preston Mills will try to provoke you. He wants you to look unstable. I know his playbook, I replied, thinking of all the times I'd watched Richard and Preston destroy their opponents over celebratory dinners. He likes to go for the jugular in the first 30 minutes. Inside the courtroom, Richard sat at the plaintiff's table, impeccable in a custom suit that probably cost more than my new apartment's yearly rent. Preston Mills lounged beside him with the casual confidence of a man who'd never lost a case. When Richard caught my eye, his lip curled slightly, the same expression he'd worn when firing employees who'd disappointed him. But something was different. The usual sycophants who filled the gallery whenever Richard made a public appearance were absent. Instead, I recognized faces from the foundation. Dr. Chen, Elena, Marcus. Janet sat in the front row, her spine straight as steel, clutching a thick folder of documents. Judge Miranda Torres entered, her reputation for no-nonsense efficiency preceding her. As we rose, I noticed her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the room. Preston Mills went for the kill immediately. Your Honor, we're here because Mrs. Lawson, Ms. Harper, I corrected quietly. He smiled, shark-like. The soon-to-be ex-Mrs. Lawson has perpetrated a massive fraud against my client. In a clear state of emotional instability following personal tragedies and the stress of divorce, she manipulated legal documents to strip away a century-old family fortune. I watched Judge Torres's expression as Preston painted his picture. Poor Richard, betrayed by his mentally unstable wife, his family's legacy stolen and squandered on charitable causes he hadn't chosen. It was a masterful performance. Furthermore, Preston continued, pulling out a file with flourish, we have evidence of Mrs. Lawson's psychiatric treatment following her miscarriage 3 years ago, prescriptions for anxiety medication, therapy sessions twice weekly. Clearly, she was in no state to make decisions about billion-dollar charitable foundations. The room went silent. I felt every eye on me, waiting for me to crumble. Richard's smile widened slightly, but then something unexpected happened. Dr. Chen stood up in the gallery. Your Honor, she called out, I request permission to address the court. Preston Mills whirled around, startled. This wasn't in his script. Judge Torres considered for a moment, then nodded, briefly. I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, head of pediatric surgery at Mount Sinai. Since Miss Harper established the foundation, we've been able to greenlight 3 new children's hospitals in underserved areas, projects that will save thousands of lives. She paused, her voice steady. Does that sound like the work of someone who's mentally unstable? Before Preston could object, Elena stood up. Elena Rodriguez, Your Honor, our foundation's education initiative has already secured funding for 10,000 scholarships. Ms. Harper personally reviews every program, asks the hard questions, ensures every dollar creates maximum impact. This is irregular, Preston protested, but more people were standing. Marcus Williams, we're creating jobs in communities Richard Lawson abandoned. Janet, I have documented evidence of Mr. Lawson's business practices that prove enough. Judge Torres's gavel cracked through the air. Mr. Mills, your emergency injunction rests on claims of Ms. Harper's mental instability and fraudulent intent. Yet I'm hearing testimony that suggests quite the opposite. She turned to me. Miss Harper, would you like to address these allegations? I stood, feeling Richard's glare burning into me. Your Honor, I did seek therapy after losing my baby. I did take medication for anxiety. I'm not ashamed of that. My voice grew stronger. But mental health support doesn't make someone unstable. It makes them stronger, wiser, more capable of seeing what needs to change. I pulled out Richard's grandmother's letter. Eleanor Lawson left a clause in her will that gave me the legal right to redirect the family fortune if certain conditions were met. She knew her grandson. She knew what he might become, and she trusted me to make the right choice. Judge Torres read the letter carefully, then looked at the documentation of the foundation's work. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Mr. Mills, she finally said, your request for an emergency injunction is denied. Furthermore, she added as Preston began to protest, I'm ordering a full review of Mr. Lawson's business practices based on the evidence Mr. Harper's team has provided. The gallery erupted. I caught glimpses of Richard's face turning purple, of Preston Mills frantically shuffling papers, of Janet smiling quietly in her seat. But mostly, I felt a weight lifting, not just the threat of the injunction, but the weight of every time Richard had made me doubt myself. Outside, Daniel Brooks was waiting with his recorder. That was quite a show, he said, falling into step beside me. Care to comment on the judge's decision? I looked back at the courthouse, where Richard was being swarmed by reporters. His carefully crafted image was cracking, showing the fury beneath. He'd lost control not just of his fortune, but of the narrative itself. Actually, I said, I do have a comment. This was never about winning or losing. It's about responsibility. To the truth, to the community, to ourselves. I smiled, thinking of Eleanor Lawson's letter. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you need help. And sometimes the wisest thing you can do is use your power to help others. As we walked away, my phone buzzed with a message from Olivia. Foundation office ASAP. The hospital project is back on, bigger than before. I looked up at the autumn sky, bright and clear above the city. Richard had taught me everything about power, how to acquire it, how to wield it, how to destroy with it, but he'd never understood the one thing his grandmother had known all along. True power isn't about what you can take. It's about what you choose to give. The first time I visited one of our construction sites, I wore the wrong shoes, standing in mud that used to be a vacant lot in Queens. I listened to the project manager explain how the new pediatric care center would serve thousands of families who currently had to travel hours for specialized treatment. My heels, a remnant from my old life, sank deeper into the dirt with every step. Ms. Harper, a small group had gathered at the chain-link fence, local residents, holding children's hands, watching the foundation being poured. One woman stepped forward. My daughter has cystic fibrosis. We've been traveling to Philadelphia for her treatments because there's nothing closer that we can afford. This hospital, it's going to change everything for us." I walked over to the fence, my expensive shoes forgotten. The woman's daughter looked about 6, with bright eyes and a butterfly clip in her hair. She reminded me of the child I'd lost, the same age she would have been. "What's your name?" I asked her. "Sophie," she said, then added proudly, "I'm going to be a doctor when I grow up." "The hospital will have a teaching program," I found myself saying, "with scholarships for local students who want to pursue medical careers. Would you like to be part of that someday?" Sophie's eyes lit up, and her mother started crying. I reached through the fence and squeezed her hand, feeling something shift inside me. This wasn't about Richard anymore. It wasn't even about me. It was about Sophie, and thousands like her. Back at the Foundation's office, I kicked off my ruined shoes and padded barefoot into the conference room where Elena was leading a strategy session. The wall-mounted TV was playing business news on mute, showing Richard entering the SEC offices. The investigation into his business practices was gaining momentum. "The community engagement numbers are incredible," Elena was saying. "Every project we announce gets flooded with local support. People want to be involved, not just receive help. That's because we're not just throwing money at problems," Marcus added. "We're building sustainable programs, creating jobs, involving the community in decisions." I sat down, thinking of Sophie and her mother. "We need to think bigger," I said. "The teaching program at the Queen's Hospital, what if we expanded that to all our facilities? Create a pipeline for local students to become healthcare providers in their own communities." The room buzzed with energy as we mapped out the idea. This was so different from the charity galas I'd attended as Richard's wife, where wealthy people congratulated themselves for writing checks while nothing really changed. My phone buzzed. A news alert. Richard's company stock had dropped 30% after preliminary findings from the SEC investigation were leaked. I clicked the link, reading about suspicious patterns in his international dealings, questionable partnerships, things I'd glimpsed over the years but never fully understood. "Madeline?" Olivia stood in the doorway. "Janet's here. She has something you need to see." Janet looked different now, more confident, less the deferential assistant. She placed a USB drive on my desk. I found these while organizing the backup servers before they let me go. Richard's private emails going back 15 years, including conversations about his grandmother's final days. My hands shook slightly as I plugged in the drive. The emails loaded, and Richard's casual cruelty spilled across my screen. He'd known his grandmother was dying, known about her concerns over his management of the family business. He'd deliberately kept her isolated in those final months, controlling who could visit, what information reached her. "He was afraid she'd change the will," Janet said quietly. "He knew she was disappointed in what he'd become, but he never imagined she'd already planted the seeds of his downfall." I closed the emails, feeling oddly empty. The Richard revealed in these messages was exactly the man I'd known him to be. Calculating, ruthless, seeing people only as pieces to be moved in his games, including me, especially me. "Have you shown these to the SEC?" I asked. Janet nodded. "In this morning. They're particularly interested in the emails about the offshore accounts." I should have felt triumphant. Richard's carefully constructed world was crumbling, just as he'd planned to destroy mine. But instead, I felt something unexpected. Pity. He would never know the joy I'd felt watching Sophie's face light up with dreams of becoming a doctor. He would never understand that true legacy isn't about money or power. It's about the lives you touch, the changes you set in motion. My desk phone rang. Dr. Chen, calling from the site of our second hospital project in Brooklyn. "Madeline, you need to come see this. The local artists have painted a mural on the construction wall. It's, well, you should see it yourself." An hour later, I stood before a vast expanse of color and hope. The mural showed a diverse group of children reaching for stars, while behind them, a garden grew from concrete. In one corner, barely noticeable unless you knew to look, was a small butterfly, just like the one in Sophie's hair. "The community did this on their own," Dr. Chen said. "They're calling it the growing place." My phone buzzed again. Another news alert about Richard, another drop in stock prices, another revelation of misconduct. I turned off the notifications. Let him face the consequences of his choices. I had more important things to focus on. "Dr. Chen," I said, still looking at the mural, "about that teaching program. I think I know someone who should be in the first class. She's a bit young right now, but she has big dreams." As we walked back to the car, discussing plans for the future. I realized I was still barefoot. My ruined heels were sitting in a trash can at the Queen's construction site. Tomorrow, I'd buy new shoes, comfortable ones, made for walking through construction sites and hospital corridors, for standing solid on the ground I'd chosen. Richard had taught me about power, but Sophie and her mother had taught me about purpose. One was crumbling, the other growing stronger every day, and I finally knew which one would last. I knew something was wrong the moment I walked into the Foundation's office. The usual morning buzz was replaced by tense silence, and Elena intercepted me before I could reach my desk. "You need to see this," she said, tablet in hand. It's all over the morning news. The headline made my blood run cold. Harper Lawson Foundation, linked to international money laundering. Below it, grainy photos showed me entering various banks over the past months, accompanied by documents that seemed to suggest suspicious financial patterns. "It's Richard," Olivia said, appearing at my shoulder. "He's throwing everything he has left at us. The SEC investigation has him cornered, so he's trying to drag us down with him." My phone started ringing. Reporters, board members, donors, the carefully built trust we'd established was under attack. Even worse, construction on our newest hospital project had been halted pending investigation. "How bad is it?" I asked, closing my office door. Olivia spread out a stack of papers. "He's clever. He's taken real documents from our legitimate international aid programs and twisted them to look suspicious, mixed in some fabricated evidence too. It's going to take time to disprove everything. And meanwhile, the people who need our help suffer." I finished. A text flashed on my phone, from Richard. "Ready to negotiate?" Of course. This was his play. Create enough chaos that I'd give him back control just to make it stop. The old Richard solution. Everyone has a breaking point. You just have to find it. I was about to delete the message when another text came through. This one from Sophie's mother. "They're saying the hospital project is canceled. Sophie's been crying all morning. Please tell me it's not true." Something snapped inside me. I grabbed my coat. "Call Daniel Brooks," I told Elena. "Tell him to meet me at the Queen's construction site in an hour. And get all our financial records ready. Everything. Completely transparent." "What are you going to do?" Olivia called after me. "I'm done playing defense." The construction site was eerily quiet when I arrived. Workers stood in clusters, uncertain about their jobs, their futures. Sophie and her mother were there too, along with other community members who'd been counting on this hospital. Daniel arrived with his camera crew just as I gathered everyone together. Behind him, more media vans were pulling up. Richard's accusations had drawn them like sharks to blood. "Ms. Harper!" they shouted. "How do you respond to allegations of money laundering? Is the Foundation a front for illegal activities? Will you be stepping down?" I held up my hand, waiting for quiet. Sophie moved closer to her mother, clutching her doctor's playset, a gift from our last community meeting. 3 months ago," I began, my voice carrying across the muddy lot. "This was an abandoned space where hope came to die. Today, it's the future site of a state-of-the-art pediatric care center. Or at least, it was supposed to be." I walked to the construction wall, touching the foundation stones already laid. "Richard Lawson wants you to believe this foundation is corrupt. He's presented carefully selected documents, twisted evidence, trying to make our international medical aid look suspicious. Why? Because he's desperate. Because what we're building here threatens everything he represents." Turning back to the cameras, I pulled out my phone and showed them Richard's text. "This morning, he offered to make it all go away, if I give him back control. That's how men like Richard operate. They think everything and everyone has a price." I moved through the crowd, making eye contact with the workers, the families, the reporters. "So let me be clear. Every document, every transaction, every decision this foundation has made is about to become public record. I've instructed our team to release everything. Total transparency. Let the world see exactly what we're doing and why." Sophie stepped forward suddenly, her small voice clear in the morning air. "Are you going to finish my hospital?" I knelt down to her level, aware of the cameras but focusing only on her face. "Sophie, do you remember what you told me you want to be when you grow up?" She nodded. "A doctor. Why?" "Because..." She glanced at her mother, then straightened her shoulders. "Because I want to help people like me, so they won't be scared when they're sick." I stood, facing the cameras again. That's what Richard Lawson is really afraid of. Not just that we're giving away his money, but that we're giving power to people he spent his life ignoring. Every hospital we build, every scholarship we fund, every life we change. It's one more crack in the system he thrived on. My phone buzzed again. Richard calling now. I declined the call. So no, I'm not stepping down. No, we're not stopping construction. And no, there will not be any negotiations. The truth doesn't negotiate. Daniel's camera caught it all. The workers returning to their posts. The machines humming back to life. Sophie hugging her mother as tears streamed down both their faces. A story not about scandal, but about resilience. Back at the office, Olivia was waiting with news. The SEC just announced a formal indictment of Richard. They're using Janet's emails as evidence of long-term fraud. I nodded, watching the construction site live stream on my computer. Sophie was still there, showing other children her doctor's kit, their parents talking about organizing a community support group. He'll try something else, Olivia warned. You know he won't stop. I know, I said, touching the screen where Sophie's face beamed. But neither will we. My phone buzzed one last time. Another text from Richard. You'll regret this. I typed back. No, Richard. The only thing I regret is how long it took me to find my voice. Then I turned off my phone and went back to work. There was a hospital to build, and I'd promised a little girl she'd have a chance to become a doctor. The day Richard was arrested, I was planting a garden. Not the meticulously manicured type that had surrounded his mansion, but a small community garden behind the Queen's Hospital construction site. Sophie had suggested it during one of our weekly progress meetings, so people can watch things grow while they're getting better. My hands were deep in the soil when Olivia's call came through my earbuds. They're taking him in now. It's all over the news. I sat back on my heels, watching Sophie and other local children carefully placing seedlings in the plots we'd marked out. The morning sun caught the butterfly clip in her hair. She wore one every day now, her signature look. How bad is it? I asked, brushing dirt from my jeans. 27 counts of fraud, tax evasion, and securities violations. Janet's evidence was devastating. They're saying he could face up to 30 years. 30 years. The number hit me like a physical blow. I looked at my muddy hands, remembering how they used to shake when Richard was angry, how I'd grip my own wrists under the dinner table to stay still while he berated waiters or subordinates. Madeline? Olivia's voice softened. Are you okay? I need to go, I said, ending the call. Sophie looked up from her planting. Ms. Harper? We found worms. That means the soil is good, right? I forced a smile. That's exactly right. Nature's little helpers. But my mind was spinning backward through time. The day I met Richard at a charity auction, dazzled by his confidence. Our whirlwind courtship. The gradual dimming of my own light as his grew brighter. The miscarriage. The subtle cruelties. The years of watching him destroy people while I sat silently by his side. My mom says you're in the newspaper again, Sophie continued, oblivious to my turmoil. She says you're a hero. A hero. The word felt wrong. Heroes didn't spend 15 years enabling someone like Richard. Heroes didn't wait until their own comfort was threatened before taking action. I need to check on something, I told the garden team. Keep planting. You're all doing great work. I drove without thinking, muscle memory taking me to the cemetery where my baby was buried. Richard hadn't wanted a marker. Best to move forward quickly, he'd said, but I'd insisted on a small stone. For years, it had been my secret place, the only spot where I could cry freely. The stone was simple, baby Harper Lawson, and the date. I'd never given her a name. Richard had said it would make the loss harder. Now I wondered if he'd been protecting himself, not me. I'm sorry, I whispered, touching the cool granite. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough then. I'm sorry I let him dim my light for so long. I thought I might find you here. I whirled around. Victoria stood a few feet away, looking nothing like the polished mistress who'd helped Richard plan our divorce. Her designer clothes were gone, replaced by simple jeans and a sweater. She looked younger, more real. How did you know? I asked. Richard told me about this place once. He was drunk, angry about something at work. He said this was where you'd come to be weak. She moved closer, looking at the stone. He said he hated that you wouldn't just get over it like he had. Anger flared in my chest, but it felt different now. Cleaner, more righteous. Why are you here, Victoria? I saw the news about Richard, and I've been following what you're doing with the foundation. She hugged herself, looking small. I was pregnant, you know. When he found out, he took care of it. Said it wasn't the right time. Said we had to think practically. The anger transformed into something else. Understanding, compassion. Shared pain. Come with me, I said. There's something you should see. Back at the hospital site, the garden was coming alive. More families had joined in, bringing plants from home, sharing stories and hopes. Sophie was teaching younger children how to pat the soil gently around tender seedlings. What is this? Victoria asked. And it's a healing garden, I explained. Sophie's idea. She said people need to see beautiful things growing while they wait for test results or visit sick relatives. She said hope should have flowers. Victoria walked slowly along the planted rows. And this helps. Growing things, everything helps. Planting seeds, building hospitals, telling the truth, even crying at gravestones. I touched her arm gently. Even saying no to men like Richard. She started crying then. Quiet tears that seemed to wash away layers of carefully constructed facade. I held her while she cried, there among the newly planted flowers and vegetable starts, surrounded by the gentle murmur of community. My phone buzzed. Daniel Brooks. Richard's lawyer is floating a plea deal. He's willing to testify against bigger fish in exchange for a lighter sentence. Want to comment? I watched Sophie showing Victoria how to plant marigolds. The little girl's face serious as she explained about proper depth and watering. Tell them this, I said. Tell them that while Richard Lawson plots legal strategies from his cell, we're planting gardens. While he counts years, we're counting seedlings. And while he looks for deals to save himself, we're building something that will save others. After Daniel hung up, I joined Sophie and Victoria in the garden. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across our work. But fairy lights strung along the construction wall twinkled to life, creating a magical space. Ms. Harper? Sophie asked, hands dirty but eyes bright. Can we name the garden? I looked at the small stone markers we'd used to label the plots, thinking of another stone in a quiet cemetery. What name were you thinking? The Hope Garden, she said firmly. Because that's what grows here. Victoria's hands stilled in the soil. I saw her touch her stomach briefly. A gesture so quick I might have missed it if I hadn't made the same move countless times myself. The Hope Garden, I repeated, tasting the words. Perfect. Because hope is like a seed, isn't it? Sometimes it lies dormant for a long time, waiting for the right moment to grow. As if in response, a butterfly, a real one, landed on Sophie's hair clip, its wings catching the last rays of sunlight. We all watched in wonder as it rested there for a moment before flying off into the gathering dusk. Some things break you, some things remake you, and sometimes, in the space between breaking and remaking, something new takes root and grows. The conference room at the Manhattan District Attorney's office felt smaller than I remembered. Maybe because the last time I'd been here, I'd still been Richard's wife, sitting silently while he handled unfortunate business matters, with his usual smooth charm. Now, I sat on the other side of the table, watching Assistant DA Sarah Reynolds spread documents across its polished surface. Mr. Lawson's plea deal could blow open 3 major financial fraud cases, she explained. But we need your testimony to corroborate certain details. I picked up one of the documents, a guest list from a charity gala 5 years ago. Names jumped out at me. Senators, CEOs, power brokers who'd laughed at Richard's jokes and accepted his generous donations. How many of them had been part of his schemes? You understand what this means? Sarah continued. These are powerful people, the kind who can make problems for your foundation. Before I could respond, my phone lit up with a text from Victoria. At the Hope Garden. Need to talk. I'll testify, I told Sarah, standing up. Send the details to Olivia. But right now, I have somewhere more important to be. I found Victoria sitting on one of the new benches we'd installed around the garden's perimeter. In the month since Richard's arrest, she'd become a regular volunteer, though she usually came during off hours, still uncomfortable with crowds. The garden had flourished under the community's care. Vegetables were already sprouting, and the first flowers were beginning to bloom. I'm pregnant, she said without preamble. Again, different man, obviously. I haven't told anyone else. I sat beside her, watching a group of kids from the neighborhood watering the tomato plants. Sophie was among them, wearing a toy stethoscope along with her ever-present butterfly clip. What do you want to do? I asked quietly. That's just it. Victoria's hands twisted in her lap. For the first time in my life, I'm making my own choices. No Richard telling me what's practical. No family expectations. Just me. She touched her stomach gently. And this. A commotion at the garden entrance drew our attention. Elena was hurrying toward us, tablet in hand. "Madeline, you need to see this. Now." The tablet showed a live stream of a press conference. One of the CEOs named in Richard's plea deal was speaking, his face ashen. "In light of recent revelations, I am announcing my immediate resignation. Furthermore, I will be donating my entire golden parachute, approximately $300 million, to the Harper Lawson Foundation. That's the third one this week," Elena said excitedly. "They're all trying to get ahead of the investigations. The foundation's endowment has nearly doubled." I handed the tablet back, thinking of my conversation with the DA. The dominoes were falling, each revelation leading to another, the ripples spreading far beyond Richard's original circle. "Mom, what will you do with all that money?" Victoria asked. Before I could answer, Sophie came running up, her toy stethoscope bouncing. "Miss Harper, we found monarchs." She led us to a corner of the garden where several butterfly chrysalises hung from the underside of a leaf. "They're like the one on my clip," she explained proudly. "Ms. Victoria helped me look up their migration pattern. Did you know they travel thousands of miles? But they need special plants to survive." I watched Victoria kneel beside Sophie, their heads close together as they discussed butterfly habitats. Something clicked in my mind. "Elena," I called, "get the board together. I have an idea." 2 hours later, I stood before the Foundation's board, including our newest member. Dr. Chen had insisted we add a community representative, and Sophie's mother now sat among the suits and credentials. "Butterfly corridors," I explained, pointing to the map on the screen. "We buy vacant lots between our hospital sites, create connected green spaces with native plants, not just gardens, but entire ecosystems, places where healing happens naturally. The maintenance costs," someone began, "will be handled by community programs." Sophie's mother interrupted. "You should see how many people want to help with the Hope Garden. Give people a chance to build something beautiful, and they'll pour their hearts into it." The vote was unanimous. As the board members filed out, Victoria lingered. "I want to help," she said. "Not just with the garden, with everything. I have a degree in environmental science, you know. Before Richard, I thought about the chrysalises in the garden, the transformation happening inside them. And we could use someone to oversee the corridor project, someone who understands both the science and the human side." Her smile was genuine, perhaps the first real one I'd seen from her. "I'd like that." My phone buzzed. Daniel Brooks again. The DA's office leaked details of the upcoming indictments. "Want to comment on your ex-husband taking down half of Wall Street?" I looked out the window at the Hope Garden, where Sophie was showing other children the chrysalises, her face glowing with the joy of discovery. Beyond her, the hospital construction rose steadily, its walls already decorated with community artwork. Victoria sat on her bench, one hand resting on her stomach, hope cautiously blooming in her eyes. "No comment about Richard," I told Daniel, "but I do have a story for you. It's about butterflies and gardens, and how transformation spreads, about how when you give people room to grow, they can fly farther than anyone imagined." "That's not the story people are expecting," he said. I watched a monarch butterfly, perhaps one of the last of the season, float past my window. Maybe it's the story they need. Later, alone in my office, I found myself looking at old photos on my phone. Richard at charity galas, always the center of attention. Me beside him, smile perfect but eyes empty. I deleted them all, replacing them with a new photo. Sophie and Victoria in the garden, surrounded by flowers and vegetables, both of them genuinely laughing. The Foundation's new mission statement, approved by the board that afternoon, glowed on my computer screen. Growing hope, one garden at a time. Not the empire Richard had tried to build, but something stronger, a network of life and healing, spreading through the city like monarch butterflies following their ancient paths home. My phone buzzed one last time. A message from Richard's prison email account. I deleted it without reading it. "Some cocoons you need to break out of. Others you need to leave behind." The storm hit New York without warning. Not the metaphorical kind I'd grown used to handling, but an actual late autumn superstorm that turned the sky an apocalyptic shade of green. I stood at my office window, watching trees bend in Central Park, thinking about how quickly things can change. "The Hope Garden," Victoria burst in, raincoat dripping. "The wind, it's destroying everything." We drove through flooded streets, wipers barely keeping up with the deluge. The hospital construction site had been secured, but the garden lay exposed to the elements. As we pulled up, I saw dozens of people already there, community members fighting to save what they'd built. Sophie and her mother were attempting to cover the vegetable beds with tarps. Others were creating windbreaks from whatever they could find. The butterfly chrysalises hung precariously, their leaf shelter threatening to tear away at any moment. "Ms. Harper," Sophie called out, rain plastering her hair to her face. "We have to save them." I waded into the chaos, my designer rain boots, a recent concession to my new life of practical work, sinking into mud. Together with Victoria, we began coordinating the efforts, turning the scattered energy into organized action. My phone rang. "Olivia, turn on the news." Now, someone had a tablet in their car. We huddled under a tarp to watch the breaking story. Questions arise about Harper Lawson Foundation's rapid expansion. The camera cut to a familiar face, Preston Mills, Richard's former lawyer, standing beside a group of Richard's old business associates. The foundation's recent acquisitions of property across the city raised serious concerns, Preston was saying. "We're filing a motion to freeze all assets pending investigation into possible violations of charitable trust laws." Victoria's hand found mine in the darkness. "Can they do that?" Before I could answer, a massive crack split the air. The old oak tree at the garden's edge, the one that had survived decades of urban development, was falling. People scattered, but Sophie slipped in the mud, directly in the tree's path. I moved without thinking, sprinting through the rain. I grabbed her, rolling us both clear as the massive trunk crashed down inches away. For a moment, we lay there in the mud, hearts pounding. "The butterflies," Sophie whispered. "The tree was protecting them." I looked up. The oak had indeed been sheltering the corner where the chrysalises hung. Now, they were exposed to the full fury of the storm. Victoria was already moving, medical kit in hand. "Sophie, are you hurt?" As she checked Sophie over, I gathered the garden volunteers. The rain was somehow getting worse, but no one had left. They stood there, faces determined, waiting for direction. "The foundation's under attack," I told them honestly. "And now this storm, it feels like everything we've built is being threatened at once. So we fight back," Sophie's mother said firmly. "Like you taught us." I looked at their faces, people who'd found hope in this garden, community in this space. Victoria, one hand protectively over her growing belly, the other still holding her medical kit. Sophie, muddy but undaunted, her butterfly clip somehow still in place. "Okay," I said, "here's what we do." Over the next hours, we battled the storm together. Someone brought industrial lights from the construction site, setting them up so we could work through the darkness. Others arrived with supplies, lumber, tools, tarps. Word spread through social media, and more people came, forming a human chain to move the chrysalises to a hastily constructed shelter. My phone kept buzzing, Olivia with updates about Preston's legal attack, reporters wanting comments, board members concerned about the foundation's future. I let them wait. Right now, this garden, these people, needed me more. By midnight, the worst of the storm had passed. The garden was battered but not beaten. The butterfly chrysalises hung safe in their new home, a structure that looked oddly beautiful under the emergency lights, with walls made of salvaged windows from the construction site. "It's stronger than before," Victoria observed, looking at the reinforcements we'd added to the beds and trellises. "And we didn't just save it, we made it better." Sophie, wrapped in a borrowed emergency blanket, nodded sagely. "That's what storms are for. My mom says they show us what needs fixing." I checked my messages finally. Preston's legal challenge was serious. He'd gathered support from several of Richard's old allies who'd escaped indictment. They were painting the foundation's expansion as reckless, questioning my leadership, suggesting that trauma from my marriage had clouded my judgment. "They're afraid," Victoria said, reading over my shoulder. "Not of what you've done, but of what you've shown is possible. Richard's old world is dying, and this," she gestured at the garden and the people still working in it, "this is what's replacing it." A commotion near the butterfly shelter drew our attention. Someone had brought a camera crew, not the usual news teams, but a documentary filmmaker who'd been following our work. "The storm changed course," the filmmaker explained. "They're saying this garden created a microclimate that helped break up the worst of it, protected this whole neighborhood. The meteorologists want to study it." I looked around at what we'd built, not just the garden, but the community it had grown. Every person here had a story, jobs found through foundation programs, medical care received at our facilities, lives changed in ways big and small. My phone buzzed again. Daniel Brooks. Preston's press conference backfired. Social media's flooded with stories from people you've helped. They're calling it the Growing Hope movement. The first light of dawn was breaking over the city. Despite the night's chaos, or perhaps because of it, the garden looked more alive than ever. New connections had formed, stronger supports built, a community tested and proven. Ms. Harper, Sophie tugged at my mud-stained sleeve. Look, in the growing light, we could see one of the chrysalises beginning to open, a monarch butterfly emerging despite everything, or maybe because of it. Its wings slowly expanded, catching the morning sun. Should we help it? Victoria asked. I shook my head, remembering my own emergence from the chrysalis of my old life. No, some things you have to do on your own, but it helps to have people watching, believing in you. As if in response, the butterfly's wings began to move, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. We all watched in silence as it took flight, rising above our battered but unbowed garden, a small miracle proving that even the hardest nights end in dawn. Let them investigate, I told Victoria. Let them question and doubt. What we're growing here is stronger than their fear. It's stronger than storms. It's stronger than Richard ever knew. The butterfly rose higher, catching a current of air, its wings glowing like stained glass in the sunrise. Below it, people began cleaning up, replanting, rebuilding, not because anyone told them to, but because they'd found something worth protecting. Sometimes the biggest changes start in the smallest gardens. Sometimes the strongest foundations are built in storms. The federal courthouse loomed before me, its stone facade somehow both familiar and foreign. I'd walked these steps many times during Richard's rise to power, always 2 steps behind him, always the silent supporter. Now, I was here to testify against him. Ready? Olivia asked, adjusting my collar. The media circus around us had reached fever pitch. Richard's testimony about his former associates had implicated half of Manhattan's financial elite. Look, Victoria called from behind us. She was holding up her phone, showing social media feeds. The Modern Growing Hope hashtag was trending nationwide. People were sharing stories of community gardens sprouting up in cities across the country, inspired by what we'd started in Queens. They're watching the live stream at the Hope Garden, she added. Sophie made everyone butterfly pins to wear for luck. I touched the small butterfly pin on my own lapel. Sophie had insisted I wear it today. Some luck, I said softly, and some truth. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Preston Mills sat with his remaining clients. His usual swagger dimmed. The investigation sparked by Richard's plea deal had taken down many of his highest-paying customers. Janet sat in the front row, her posture straight, her eyes steady. She'd testified yesterday about years of covering up Richard's schemes. Then Richard was brought in. Prison hadn't treated him well. His carefully maintained image had cracked, showing the gray roots in his hair, the shadows under his eyes. When he saw me, his lip curled in that familiar way, but something else flickered across his face. Uncertainty. The prosecutor stood. The state calls Madeline Harper. Walking to the witness stand, I felt the weight of every step. This wasn't just about Richard's crimes anymore. It was about all the small corruptions that enable larger ones, all the silences that allow power to corrupt. Ms. Harper, the prosecutor began, please tell the court about the conversation you had with the defendant on March 15th of last year, regarding the Anderson merger. I looked directly at Richard as I spoke. He came home excited that night, said he'd finally handled the Anderson problem. He'd found out that David Anderson's daughter was in recovery for addiction, and he'd used that information to force the family to sell at a fraction of the company's worth. And how did the defendant appear while telling you this? Proud, I said simply. He was proud of destroying a family to win a business deal. Richard's new lawyer objected, but I continued, my voice steady. That was his pattern. Find weakness, exploit it, celebrate the victory. He did it with business rivals, with employees, with his own family. During the cross-examination, Richard's lawyer tried to paint me as a vindictive ex-wife, a mentally unstable woman seeking revenge. I sat calmly, answering each question with the same quiet strength I'd found in the garden. Isn't it true, the lawyer pressed, that you systematically planned to steal Mr. Lawson's inheritance? No, I replied. I executed a legal transfer of assets according to his grandmother's wishes. She knew what her grandson had become. She left me the power to make things right. And you think destroying Mr. Lawson's life is right? I leaned forward slightly. Richard destroyed his own life. I just stopped him from destroying others. During the lunch break, Daniel Brooks showed me the latest news on his phone. The Growing Hope movement had evolved into something bigger. People weren't just creating gardens. They were exposing corruption in their own communities, starting local foundations, reclaiming spaces and power. "You've started a revolution," he said. "And it's growing like a garden," I finished, smiling. Back in court, Richard finally took the stand for his final testimony. He looked smaller somehow, his expensive prison-issued suit hanging loose on his frame. "Mr. Lawson," the prosecutor said, "please tell the court about your grandmother's last wishes." Richard's eyes found mine. "She was disappointed in me," he said, his voice barely carrying across the courtroom. "She saw what I was becoming. She tried to warn me." A murmur ran through the gallery. This wasn't part of his plea deal script. "The foundation," he continued, looking down at his hands. "I've seen what they're building. What Madeline's building. It's what my grandmother wanted all along." His lawyer tried to interrupt, but Richard waved him off. "I thought power meant control, forcing people to do what you want, taking what you want. But watching from my cell, seeing what real power can do." He looked up, meeting my eyes again. I was wrong. Later, outside the courthouse, Victoria found me sitting on a bench, processing everything. "Sophie's on FaceTime," she said, holding out her phone. "The garden has some news." Sophie's excited face filled the screen. Behind her, I could see a crowd gathered around the butterfly shelter. "Ms. Harper, they're all hatching. All the chrysalises, all at once. Everyone's here watching. Even the news people." The camera panned to show dozens of monarchs emerging, their wings slowly opening in the afternoon sun. The garden was full of people wearing butterfly pins, their faces upturned in wonder. "Perfect timing," I said, feeling tears start. "Why are you crying?" Sophie asked. "This is happy." "Yes," I agreed, watching the butterflies take flight on her screen while Victoria squeezed my hand. "Yes, it is." Back at the foundation office, Olivia was waiting with Preston Mills. "My remaining clients want to make a deal," he said, looking uncomfortable in our simple conference room. "They've seen the writing on the wall. They want to donate their assets to the foundation before the investigations reach them. On one condition," Olivia added. "They want to remain anonymous." I thought about Richard's face in court, about the cost of secrets and silence. "No deals?" I said. "If they want redemption, they need to earn it. Like Victoria did, like I did, in the open, in the light." Preston started to argue, but I held up my hand. "Tell them to visit the Hope Garden. Watch the butterflies emerge. See what happens when you stop hiding and start growing." After they left, I stood at my window, looking toward Queens where I knew the garden was alive with monarchs taking flight. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. For a moment, I thought it might be Richard again, but it was a photo from Sophie. Hundreds of butterflies rising against the sunset, their wings catching the light like stained glass, like hope made visible. Sometimes the truth sets you free, and sometimes it gives you wings. 1 year later, I stood in the rooftop garden of our completed Queen's Hospital, watching Sophie give tours to the families arriving for the grand opening. She wore her white junior volunteer coat proudly, butterfly clip catching the morning sun as she explained the healing garden's features to visitors. "The butterflies always come back," she was telling a young patient in a wheelchair. "Even when they migrate thousands of miles away, they remember the way home. That's why we planted these special flowers, to help them find us." Victoria appeared beside me, her 6-month-old daughter Emily, asleep in a carrier decorated with embroidered monarchs. "The other hospital sites want to know when they can start their own butterfly programs," she said, gently rocking Emily. "The waiting list for garden volunteers is getting ridiculous." I smiled, remembering the chaos of that stormy night a year ago. The garden hadn't just survived, it had thrived, spreading across the city through a network of green corridors. The Monarch Growing Hope movement had evolved into a national coalition of community foundations, each adapting our model to their local needs. "Have you seen the latest numbers?" Olivia joined us, tablet in hand. "The foundation's approach is being studied by universities now. They're calling it regenerative philanthropy, the idea that giving can actually create more resources than it uses." My phone buzzed. A text from Janet. Turning on the news, Channel 4. We gathered around Victoria's phone to watch. Richard stood outside a minimum security prison, squinting in the sunlight. He'd been released early for good behavior and his cooperation in the ongoing investigations. "Mr. Lawson," a reporter called out, "what are your plans now?" Richard looked different, older, but somehow more real. The polished mask he'd worn for so long was gone. "I'm going to try to make amends," he said simply, "starting with the communities I hurt. And the foundation. Your ex-wife's work." He smiled slightly, not his old, calculated smile, but something more genuine. Madeline was right. My grandmother was right. Real power isn't about control. It's about growth. I turned away from the broadcast, focusing instead on the garden around us. The hospital's young patients were scattered throughout the space, some in wheelchairs, others walking with IV poles, all of them touching plants, watching butterflies, finding moments of joy in their healing journey. Sophie bounded up, her tour complete. "Ms. Harper, remember when you first told me I could be a doctor? Well, guess what? I got the highest score in my science class, and my teacher says if I keep working hard, I corrected gently, when you become a doctor." She beamed, then turned serious. "I saw Mr. Richard on TV in the waiting room. Is he going to try to take the garden away?" "No, sweetheart," Victoria answered, adjusting Emily's butterfly-decorated blanket. "Some changes can't be undone. Some growth can't be reversed." As if to prove her point, a monarch butterfly landed on Emily's carrier. The baby stirred, opening eyes that seemed to track the orange and black wings with fascination. "They remember," Sophie whispered, "just like I told the other kids. They always find their way back." Daniel Brooks arrived for the official opening ceremony, his camera crew capturing the moment. "Care to make a statement?" he asked. "Something about triumph over adversity, perhaps." I looked around at what we'd built, not just the hospital and garden, but the web of connections, the community of healing, the legacy of hope. Sophie was showing Emily the butterfly, while Victoria watched them both with tears in her eyes. Olivia was reviewing expansion plans with Dr. Chen, their heads bent together over future possibilities. "No statements," I said. "Just truth. Sometimes the smallest seeds create the biggest changes. Sometimes the longest journeys happen in the space between breaking and becoming. And sometimes, Sophie chimed in, her junior volunteer badge glinting. "You have to fly away to find your way home." The ceremony began, families and staff gathering in the garden. I watched a young patient release a newly emerged butterfly, her face glowing as it took flight. Above us, the city stretched out under a clear autumn sky, its harsh edges softened by the green corridors we'd created, its future brightened by the changes we'd set in motion. My phone buzzed one last time, a message from Richard. "Thank you." I deleted it without responding. Some chapters need to stay closed so new ones can begin. Instead, I turned to the gathered crowd, to the community we'd grown, to the future we were still cultivating. "Welcome," I said, "to the Growing Hope Network's first integrated healing center. This garden, this hospital, this community, they're just the beginning, because hope, like butterflies, knows no boundaries, and change, once started, tends to spread its wings." Sophie slipped her small hand into mine as the crowd applauded. Above us, monarchs danced in the autumn light, their wings catching the sun like stained glass, like promises kept, like dreams taking flight. Some endings are really beginnings in disguise. Some broken things heal stronger than before. And some gardens, planted in storms and tended with love, bloom far beyond their borders, spreading seeds of change on the wings of butterflies, growing hope in every heart they touch. The garden was full, the future was growing, and we were all, in our own ways, finally home. The end. Thanks for watching to the end. What did you think of this story? Let us know in the comments below. We value your opinion. Click the like button if you enjoyed it, and be sure to subscribe to receive more captivating stories. Activate the bell so that you're always the first to know when a new video is published. See you next time.